Introduction: Mystery in a small American town. Let me take you back to a humid summer night in the heart of America, where the air holds secrets and the streets whisper stories that linger long after sunset. There's something different about small towns, especially in the American South, where everyone seems to know everyone. Front doors are left unlocked, and the concept of true danger feels like a distant threat reserved for city dwellers. Yet, it's these very places, nestled between endless fields, old diners, and one-road highways, that sometimes harbor the gravest of mysteries. The town of Briarwood in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, is exactly that kind of place. It's the sort of quiet, close-knit community where news travels fast and rumors travel even faster, but where people tend to believe that nothing truly awful could ever happen to one of their own. Businesses close early, neighbors wave as they sit on their front porches, and the local salon is much more than a place for a haircut. It's a social hub, a confessional, and the pulse of the community. But on one fateful evening in midsummer 1995, the illusion of safety was shattered. The peace of Briarwood was broken by a violent crime that forever altered the town's sense of innocence. The owner of the beloved Briarwood Hair Studio, a young woman respected and adored by all, was found dead in circumstances so shocking that they rattled even the seasoned detectives of Spartanburg County. It wasn't just the loss of a neighbor or business owner, it was as if someone had snatched away the very heart of the town. What made the tragedy even more haunting was the mysterious, almost cinematic way it unfolded. There were witnesses, fleeting glimpses of a suspect escaping into the night, and a trail of evidence that seemed at first promising. Yet, despite the initial flurry of police activity and neighbors coming together in fear and disbelief, the answers did not come. The killer vanished as if swallowed by the darkness, and the case, despite its high profile, soon grew cold. Years would pass, suspicion and sadness woven into the tapestry of daily life in Briarwood. The townsfolk locked their doors a bit earlier, parents kept a closer watch on their children, and unsolved questions echoed in each conversation at the salon that once was the center of community spirit. Yet through long nights and countless dead ends, the hope for justice stubbornly remained. The story I'm about to share with you is not only about a tragic loss and a criminal on the run, it is a testament to resilience, persistence, and the relentless search for truth amid the tangled shadows of small-town America. Let's step back together into that unforgettable summer and follow the trail of clues that would one day, against all odds, bring long-awaited closure to a town frozen in time. The victim, a talented woman at the heart of her community. Dana Whitfield was more than just a familiar face in Briarwood. She was the spark that kept the town's heart beating. At 27, she was already the proud owner of Briarwood Hair Studio, a cozy salon that had withstood the test of time and economy, thanks to her determination, wit, and boundless charm. For locals, a visit to Dana's salon wasn't simply about a trim or a new style. It was a ritual, an escape from routine, and, most importantly, a trusted corner to share laughter, worries, and the quiet news of daily life. Dana had a gift for connection. She remembered every regular's birthday, their children's milestones, and the stories they quietly revealed between the snips of her scissors. Her infectious laugh could be heard over the hum of the dryers, and when she hosted small Friday evening socials, neighbors would arrive just for her company. She was the one people sought for advice, for a kind word, or sometimes simply to feel seen. Outside her salon, Dana juggled the roles of young mother, business owner, and friend, with a resilience that inspired many in Briarwood, especially women hoping to carve their own path. She was married, the mother of two, and known for her energy and sense of style, from her effortlessly perfect hair to her trademark string of pearls that seemed to never leave her neck. While her marriage to Mark Whitfield had seen better days, she maintained her dignity, putting her children first and refusing to let personal hardships dim her light in public. Her customers ranged from elderly gentlemen seeking their regular shaves, to high school girls saving up for prom hairstyles, even to newcomers who walked in simply drawn by Dana's reputation. Every client was greeted as if they were an old friend returning home. Perhaps it was this openness that made her loss later feel so intensely personal to every resident. Dana was the thread quietly holding so many pieces of Briarwood together. But Dana's life wasn't only sunshine. The pressures of running a business single-handedly, the challenges of separation, and the weight of raising her kids in a town where gossip spread fast were ever-present shadows. Yet, she handled every struggle with a sense of humor and quiet perseverance. If she ever felt overwhelmed, few people ever saw it. That strength, that consistent kindness, Those would be the things Briarwood would struggle to live without, when their beloved Dana was gone. In the days before her death, life seemed ordinary. Early morning coffee runs, playful phone calls with her sister, jotting down new hairstyle ideas, and stashing away small bills for her kids' school expenses. No one could have guessed that behind her determined smile, fate was quietly spinning a much darker story for Dana Whitfield. Had anyone looked closer, would they have seen a warning in her tired eyes? Or maybe sensed an uneasiness in her last goodbyes? In hindsight, it's the ordinary rhythms of her life that made her tragedy all the more unfathomable. The final night, that fateful July evening. As the sun dipped behind the low-slung oaks lining Briarwood's Main Street, the air on July 31, 1995 seemed heavier than usual. A vague sense of anticipation, or maybe just the residue of midsummer's unrelenting heat. It was a Monday, and for Dana Whitfield, it started out as ordinary as any other. Briarwood Hair Studio was quiet that evening. The fragrance of shampoo and faint hum of fluorescent bulbs drifted out into the street while Dana wiped down her chairs and swept up the last traces of hair clippings from the tile floor. She wasn't expecting company this late, but sometimes a neighbor would pop in with a pie or stop by for a quick chat. That evening, Dana's only guest was Sheila Moore, a friendly local who sometimes sold cleaning supplies door to door. Around 6:30 p.m., Sheila stopped by with a bottle of bleach, chatted briefly about the weather, then headed back out for her evening rounds. Inside, Dana lingered, tidying up, checking inventory, going through receipts, the quietly industrious tasks of a small business owner winding down another day. Sometimes she'd call her sister during these hours or scribble hairstyle ideas for her high school clients getting ready for senior portraits. The phone rang once or twice, each time Dana's familiar voice answered, bright and reassuring. Through the front window, the golden dusk of South Carolina seemed to wrap the narrow street in a thick, sleepy haze. Around 8:11 p.m., Sheila, now heading home, passed by the salon and noticed Dana still cleaning up inside. The two women exchanged a wave, one of those small wordless gestures that only make sense in a town where everyone knows each other. No one realized it then, but this would be the last time Sheila, or anyone, would see Dana alive. At approximately 8:30 p.m., as Sheila waited for her ride home beneath a street lamp outside the hair studio, she saw something that made her skin prickle. The salon's lights, so recently a beacon of homely industry, suddenly flickered off. Moments later, a muffled crash sounded from within, echoing eerily onto Main Street. Sheila tensed. Was it a break-in or just Dana dropping something? What happened next would become the stuff of restless town legend and sleepless nights. A man vaulted awkwardly out the salon's narrow window. In the uncertain shadows, he noticed Sheila and, realizing he'd been spotted, yanked his sweatshirt over his face before bolting around the side of the building. Adrenaline spiking, Sheila darted in the opposite direction, the reality of danger only now registering. Their paths crossed once more outside a nearby store. In a fleeting, tense second, Sheila got a clear look at the stranger's pale, anxious features. An image she'd replay for detectives countless times. In shock and fearing for her own safety, Sheila frantically tried to flag down passing cars, desperate for help. But at that hour, the street was nearly deserted, just the hum of distant cicadas and the hollow click of her footsteps. Finally, breathless and trembling, she reached a neighborhood shop, dialed 911, and set a somber chain of events into motion that would shake Briarwood for years. Inside Briarwood Hair Studio, the story had already taken its tragic turn. What was left behind in that steamy July night was more than a crime scene. It was the end of a chapter for a woman, a family, and an entire community. The small details would haunt them all, the scent of Dana's favorite lilac candle lingering, a forgotten mug of coffee, blinds askew on the freshly washed window, everything seemingly in place except for the soul who united them all. Chance witness and shadows on Main Street. On an ordinary summer evening in Briarwood, when streetlights painted long shadows on Main Street and most houses vibrated with the gentle buzz of routine, fate positioned Sheila Moore exactly where she had never wanted to be. Sheila was known throughout Briarwood as practical and level-headed, a woman who traversed the town's patchwork of sidewalks selling cleaning products door to door, always finishing her rounds around sunset. On that fateful night, she unknowingly became the living thread that connected the town, the crime, and the shadowy perpetrator. As the last rays of sun receded, Sheila wrapped up her deliveries and glanced toward Briarwood Hair Studio, Dana's beloved shop. She saw Dana still working late, her silhouette framed warmly by the golden glow in the window. Sheila offered her a quick, companionable wave, one of those wordless, everyday gestures instantly understood between women who looked out for each other in a small town. That single moment would echo in Sheila's mind countless times, growing heavier in hindsight. Main Street was usually a sanctuary after dark. Kids rode bikes home before curfew, couples walked dogs, someone always called out a friendly greeting from their front porch. But that night the air seemed unusually still, as if even the familiar cicadas paused their chorus in anticipation. Sheila walked slowly toward her pickup spot, waiting for her boyfriend to collect her as she did 3 times a week. Street lamps created a safe oasis in the dusk, until suddenly, that illusion was shattered. The shop lights went out, crisp and immediate, as if someone had flipped a switch on the day itself. A thud rang out, unnatural in its urgency. Sheila stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. At first, it might have been nothing, a fallen comb or a slammed cabinet. Instinctively, Sheila peered through the growing darkness, and before she could register what was amiss, she saw movement at the front window. A man, unknown, frantic, exuding panic, hurled himself out of the narrow salon window. He landed roughly, scrambled to his feet, and for a split second their eyes locked. It was an image Sheila would never forget. Pale skin, anxious features, a desperate hand yanking the hood of a gray sweatshirt over his face. He darted into the alley, shadow slithering behind him while Sheila's breath caught in her throat. Neither of them expected an audience, and for a heartbeat, Main Street was a tableau of fear and confusion. Frantically, Sheila backed away, instinct screaming at her to move, to get help, to escape whatever danger she'd just witnessed. She spun in the opposite direction, footsteps ringing on the pavement, pulse roaring in her ears. The streets felt cavernous and empty as she stumbled toward the nearest store. Fate, cruel or ironic, caused their paths to cross again just minutes later at the entrance of that neighborhood grocery. This time, under ugly fluorescent lights, Sheila saw the man's face, confused and wild, before he turned and vanished. Those fleeting, high-voltage seconds seared the stranger's image into her memory, details she would later recount to investigators again and again. In the aftermath, Main Street never felt quite the same. Sheila's frantic attempts to flag down a car for help were ignored, mistaken for a benign late-night request in a town that still believed itself too innocent for tragedy. The silence, the empty roads, the yellow pallor of sodium lights all seemed to conspire against a quick response. But Sheila refused to give up. Trembling, breathless, she burst into the safety of the corner store and dialed 911. Her words, fragmented, afraid but determined, became the bridge between that night's chaos and the desperate search for justice that would overtake Briarwood. That summer evening, the ordinary world darkened, and Sheila Moore became the lone sentinel alerting the town that something unimaginable had crept out of the shadows. On that balmy July evening, while Briarwood's main street looked no different from any other summer night, fate brought an unwitting observer to the very heart of the unfolding tragedy. Sheila Moore, a practical woman who made her rounds in town selling cleaning supplies, became the kind of accidental witness every small-town detective hopes for, yet dreads for the trauma it inflicts. Sheila didn't know that as she wrapped up her day, her path would cross directly with both victim and criminal. At around 8:11 p.m., Sheila was finishing her last delivery, and as she passed by Briarwood Hair Studio, she caught sight of Dana inside, still tidying up, aglow in the shop's gentle lights. Their wave was quick, wordless, and would ring in Sheila's memory for years. The evening haze and the sweet lull of crickets sang of nothing out of the ordinary, but in reality, the air bristled with a tension she'd only fully understand much later. Sheila wandered along the street toward her usual pickup spot beneath an old flickering street lamp outside the shop. She could see distant windows shining, the silhouettes of late-night diners heading home, and the rhythmic buzz of a neon sign from Main Diner across the street. Most nights, the street would bring a sense of security. Everyone knew Sheila, and nothing bad ever seemed to happen in Briarwood. All at once, her senses pricked, as the hair studio's lights blinked off sharply. A thud echoed inside, so sudden and out of place, it sent a chill up her arms. She peered through the dusky glow, poised between the comfort of the town's predictability and the dawning realization that she was witnessing something profoundly wrong. Moments later, her blood ran cold. An unfamiliar man, moving with frantic, almost clumsy urgency, vaulted out of the studio's narrow window and hit the pavement hard. In the half-light, Sheila froze. The stranger, clearly startled to see anyone, yanked his hoodie up to shield his face, a gesture that left a searing impression. He dashed for the shadows bordering the hair studio, glancing back with an intensity that made Sheila's pulse hammer in her ears. For a split second their eyes met, and she caught a flash of pale skin, anxious features, and the wild energy of someone desperate to disappear. Panic sent Sheila in the opposite direction, down the sidewalk, shoes tapping furiously, heart pounding, mind blank, but for the need to get away. Around the corner she doubled back toward the safety of a nearby store. In a bizarre twist, their paths crossed again near the entrance, only intensifying Sheila's terror and the vivid imprint of the suspect's face in her memory. Night on Main Street now felt transformed, friendly shadows warped into hiding places for danger, the familiar now unrecognizable. Frantic, Sheila waved at passing cars, desperate for help, but the town's quiet rhythm meant nearly no traffic at that late hour. Undeterred and trembling, she burst into the store, found a phone, and called 911, unleashing a chain of events that would forever change life on Main Street. That night Sheila, through sheer circumstance, became the eyes and voice of an entire community shaken to its core. Shocking discovery of the victim. The air was thick with tension when the police car screeched to a halt outside Briarwood Hair Studio, its lights casting a surreal glow on the storefront windows and abandoned street. Sheila Moore's voice was still trembling over the phone when the first responding officers entered the salon, pushed the glass door open, and stepped inside. It was a scene painted with the stillness of a recently interrupted life. Magazines splayed on waiting chairs, the faint hum of a hairdryer unplugged mid-use, and beyond the reception counter, the lingering perfume of lilac and hairspray. No one was ready for what they would find next. The back hallway was dim, a single overhead bulb sputtering. In the cramped bathroom that doubled as a utility closet, Dana Whitfield was found seated against the hot water heater, her head slumped, delicate hands bound at her sides with improvised cords. Bruises marked her skin, testimony to a desperate struggle. A pool of blood had begun to dry along the tile, stark and alarming in the harsh artificial light. The sight was so jarring some of the officers instinctively turned their faces away, fighting the urge to retch or weep. Nothing had been taken. Dana's handbag sat untouched in her locker, cash in the register undisturbed. Even her keys, a colorful fob crowded with trinkets, lay on a nearby shelf. It was clear this crime was not motivated by theft. The questions multiplied. Who could do such a thing to someone so beloved, and why? The contrast between the warmth Dana brought into the world and the coldness of her death was too much for those gathered to make sense of. Word of the discovery spread with lightning speed. By midnight, a small crowd had formed on the sidewalk outside, faces lit by the combined glow of camera flashes and ambulance beams. Some wept openly, others simply stared in stunned silence, unable to process that their friend, confidant, and town bright spot was forever gone. Mothers clutched their children closer, business owners stood in doorways murmuring condolences, and the first rumors about motive and suspects began to ripple through the summer air. In the following hours, investigators combed the scene for clues with almost reverent care. Every hairpin, every dropped receipt, every smudge on the countertop was photographed and bagged as evidence. The medical examiner worked quietly, noting the defensive wounds, the time of death, and the lack of forced entry. It was clear that the killer had either been let in or had found another way into the locked building. Speculation ran wild, even as police cordoned off the area, blocked intersections, and gently discouraged onlookers. Dana's mother, summoned to the scene, had to be supported by neighbors as her grief overtook her. The sounds of that night, the low murmur of radios, the distant wail of sirens, and the choked sobs of friends, lingered long after the street was empty once again. Early investigation and the first suspect. In the immediate aftermath of the shocking discovery at Briarwood Hair Studio, an all-consuming sense of urgency seized the local police. The officers who had seen the crime scene would later admit that something about this case felt different, haunting, violating, almost too personal for a town where everyone knew everyone. Chief Rollins, a stoic man with almost 30 years on the force, quickly called in his most experienced investigators. Within hours, thick files cluttered the desks at the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Department. Official protocol demanded calm, but the tension was palpable. They needed results, if only to restore a shred of comfort to the devastated community. The very first step was securing the scene. Forensics spent all night collecting everything: fibers from the floor mats, swabs of what appeared to be bloodstains, found under the counter and near the cramped back hallway. The UV lights revealed things the naked eye missed: minute flecks of DNA, oily fingerprints on a brass doorknob, a crumpled receipt full of greasy fingerprints. Lab techs meticulously bagged each piece of evidence and took photographs from every possible angle. Despite their thoroughness, there was an early twist. The cash register was untouched, Dana's purse was still in her locker, and even the keys to her car sat in plain view. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was, on the face of things, personal. The questions started pouring in. Who had been in the salon that evening? Who might have known Dana's routine, her habit of working late, or the fact she sometimes left the back door unlocked when expecting a friend? Officers interviewed neighbors, business owners, and Dana's regular clients late into the night. Names were scribbled down on notepads and added to an ever-growing list of leads, but almost immediately one name shot to the top: Mark Whitfield, Dana's estranged husband. Mark was a local plumber well known around town, not just as Dana's husband but a regular handyman for various local businesses. Rumors about their marital strife had been swirling for months. There had been raised voices overheard on the phone, an incident at a 4th of July cookout, and above all, a quiet sadness that even Dana's loyal friends couldn't ignore. When officers came knocking at Mark's door late that night, he answered in pajamas, visibly shaken and barely able to stammer out his disbelief. The next morning, Mark was brought in for formal questioning. He waived his right to counsel, perhaps a testament to his shock or his confidence in his innocence, and sat, tightly wound, across from two detectives. They pressed on his relationship with Dana. How recently had he been to the salon? Did he still have a key? Was there anyone who could vouch for his whereabouts during the hours of her death? Mark replied quietly. He admitted to stopping by the studio a week earlier to fix a leaky faucet and acknowledged the tension in their marriage, but adamantly denied any possibility of violence. He claimed, with glassy eyes, that he would never harm the mother of my children. Suspiciously, his fingerprints were found on the hot water heater in the utility closet, the very spot where Dana's body was discovered. However, the investigation soon revealed that Mark's fingerprints owed to his recent plumbing repairs. A maintenance receipt and corroborating statements from Dana's assistant confirmed the timeline. Still, detectives wondered if Mark could have had both motive and passing opportunity. After all, domestic disputes had far too often escalated to tragic outcomes in similar cases. His alibi, though, appeared solid. Two friends and his older son confirmed Mark had spent the evening at home on a group video call troubleshooting a mutual friend's broken sump pump. Phone records showed a string of calls that night matching his story. There were simply too many eyes, too consistent a timeline for him to have slipped away unnoticed. Though Mark was removed as a prime suspect, police felt the heat to deliver answers. The community, meanwhile, was torn. Some clung to the belief in Mark's innocence, remembering his devotion, while others gossiped in whispers at the grocery store checkout lines, hypothesizing dark motives and secrets behind Dana's perfect smile. Every rumor stoked distrust and anxiety in Briarwood, and the pressure on law enforcement ratcheted ever higher. With Mark tentatively cleared, attention turned to the small but crucial details at the crime scene. Investigators re-examined the back entry for traces of forced entry. Nothing. Every small business owner nearby was queried about strangers, late-night customers, or lingering cars. All security camera footage from the block was collected and painstakingly reviewed. Yet the only potential lead was the word of Sheila Moore, who mentioned seeing a strange man flee into the shadows. The witness account was terrifying, but all too brief to offer a name. Next came a round of deep-dive interviews. Everyone who'd seen Dana in the previous 24 hours, anyone she'd argued with, random delivery drivers, disgruntled ex-employees of the salon. It was tedious and emotionally draining for all involved. The police sketched out rough timelines, graphed Dana's last movements, and assigned patrols to quietly watch for suspicious activity. Undercover cars sat at the edges of the neighborhood for days, waiting for the suspect to return to the scene. None did. As forensic analysis progressed, scientists uncovered crucial biological evidence, including semen found within the utility closet where Dana's life was cruelly taken. This detail not only ramped up the gravity of the investigation but also shifted the tone. This was no random killing, and the act was unspeakably intimate and violent. The lab worked feverishly to process the samples, knowing every hour counted both for the case's momentum and for the community's restless anxiety. Although DNA technology in 1995 lagged behind what we have today, the samples were preserved with care, in hopes that more advanced methods might someday reveal the truth. Meanwhile, detectives explored whether Dana's tragic fate might be the result of a business rivalry, an obsessed client, or a crime of opportunity. Yet no evidence emerged of threats, blackmail, or any employee conflicts. Dana's co-workers described her as fair and generous, but overworked and occasionally wary of a few eccentric clients, none, however, with police records or tangible motives. Investigators combed through stacks of receipts, yearbooks, appointment calendars, even her private journals, but found no obvious red flags. Of course, the emotional cost was high. Dana's family made tearful pleas at televised press conferences, urging anyone with information to come forward. Local news crews set up daily outside the salon, their cameras recording silent vigils, tearful friends laying flowers, and strangers pausing in prayer. Above all, the quiet presence of Dana's two young children, confused, inconsolable, clutching hand-drawn pictures of their mother, put a painfully human face on the tragedy. Their loss became a rallying point. Briarwood, once united by cheer and routine, was now bound by grief and suspicion. As suspicion shifted away from Mark, police briefly considered the possibility of a vagrant or drifter, someone who might have passed through town by chance. But these leads dried up almost immediately. Nothing was missing or ransacked. Dana had not been the victim of a simple break-in. Officers followed up on every rumor, including supposed sightings of a blue SUV parked near the salon around the time of the murder, but license plate details and driver descriptions were frustratingly vague or contradictory. Still, these leads were tacked to the wall, forming a dense spider's web of possible scenarios. As the investigation pressed forward into its second week, the meticulous work of the detectives and lab technicians began to reveal the bounds of the case and its early limits. Each day, Captain Rollins held tense morning briefings in a cramped room at the sheriff's department, mapping new information and squaring it with what they already knew, returning, always, to the core question: if this wasn't a robbery, and if Mark Whitfield, despite his rocky relationship with Dana, was not involved, then who would have reason, or audacity, to attack her in such a personal and brutal fashion? The detectives' stress was palpable. Veteran officers confessed to insomnia, and younger team members struggled with the realization that homicide in Briarwood wasn't a tidy puzzle, but a murky, shifting riddle. Squads worked overtime, canvassing neighborhoods for unfamiliar faces and checking local sex offender registries. They ran down every last credit card receipt for nearby gas stations, every takeout order, and every car parked longer than usual on Main Street that night. Some local business owners found themselves questioned 2 or 3 times as police looked for inconsistencies or overlooked clues. No one wanted to leave a single stone unturned. The town, for its part, was both cooperative and restless. People dropped by the station with notes, rumors, even dreams. The department took every lead seriously, even if most proved fruitless. Dana's circle of friends organized nighttime patrols and started a reward fund, raising money through bake sales and community car washes. Yet underneath this surface solidarity, nerves were fraying. More locks appeared on doors, and children were called in at dusk under stricter curfews. Where neighbors once talked over coffee and pie, conversations now veered inevitably toward fear. Who among them could harbor something so dark? Meanwhile, the forensic labs delivered a sobering frustration. While they had a DNA profile from the evidence left at the scene, it matched no one in the South Carolina offenders database, a dead end in terms of prosecution, despite the promise of genetic certainty. The idea that a killer might simply walk away without a trace was almost too much for the community, for whom answers equaled closure. Yet the clues collected and the mounting evidence would prove essential for the eventual pursuit of justice, even if the breakthrough would come years or decades down the road. Finally, exhausted and at a frustrating impasse, investigators widened their scope yet again. Roadblocks were set up on the highways 2 towns over. News bulletins were handed to every gas station, hotel, and pawn shop in a 50-mile radius. Sketch artists worked with any witness able to recall the most fleeting details: a hint of a gate, a tattoo glimpsed through a car window, the outline of a jaw beneath a hood. Still nothing clicked. The blue SUV sighting proved tantalizing but mysterious. Registration checks for all vehicles matching the description in neighboring counties ran into the dozens, but none could be definitively tied to the case, or had alibis that held up under police scrutiny. Months passed. The case, which had once seemed on the verge of a quick resolution, stalled. Dana's family clung to hope, insisting repeatedly in the media that someone, somewhere, must know the truth. Police, maintaining their presence, kept in touch with every person of interest, revisiting old interviews on slow days and retesting evidence when new forensic technology became available. The public's initial outrage faded into a dull, low-grade anxiety. Briarwood remained changed, safer perhaps, but never quite the same. For detectives, the investigatory files grew into literal boxes, history's weight-gathering dust but never fading from memory. Above all, the early days of the investigation set the tone for everything that followed. Methodical, persistent, sometimes desperate but always driven by respect for Dana and her family. Though the murder had shaken Briarwood to its core, the sense of community, from sharing leads to lighting candles on the salon doorstep, made clear no one was ready to give up. And while a solid suspect had briefly loomed before slipping away, the foundation built in those painstaking months would ultimately become the starting point for the pursuit of justice, years down the line, when science and fate finally converged. The mystery of the blue SUV. As the investigation in Briarwood plodded along, questions began swirling around an unusual detail that haunted both detectives and townsfolk alike: the presence of a blue SUV near the scene on the night of Dana's murder. It wasn't just any vehicle. The Ford SUV was distinct, with custom wheels and a faded bumper sticker, the kind of car that catches the eye in a sleepy town where every unfamiliar license plate prompts speculation. Rumors about the SUV began the very night the crime occurred. Within hours, Main Street was abuzz with theories. Several townspeople recalled seeing the car parked just a block from Briarwood Hair Studio, its engine idling, windows partly rolled down in the stifling summer air. One neighbor claimed the driver was chain-smoking, nervously tapping the steering wheel. Another swore they saw two people arguing outside the vehicle. Despite varying accounts, one thing was clear: this blue SUV did not belong to any resident known to the tight-knit Briarwood community. Detectives quickly zeroed in on the lead. They canvassed the area, jotting down registration numbers, interrogating patrons of the diner across the street, and reviewing any traffic camera footage available, albeit with limited technology at the time. The investigation reached out to mechanics, hoping the car's unusual rims and bumper sticker had come up during routine maintenance. At every turn, the vehicle had disappeared like a ghost. The witness who would prove most vital was a young woman named Teresa Dillon, known for her sharp memory and attention to detail. Teresa, walking her dog that fateful night, noticed the Ford SUV parked in an awkward spot partially obscuring the intersection near the salon. She didn't recognize the vehicle, nor the young, pale-faced man sitting in the driver's seat. Later, as police pieced together her statement, she recalled the man often glancing nervously at his rearview mirror, and at one point, argued loudly with someone she couldn't see, perhaps on a cell phone, or to someone in the back seat. She later recounted feeling uneasy, her dog pulling her along a bit faster than usual, both unsettled by the tension in the air. As investigators chased down every lead, the blue SUV became a kind of spectral presence, half fact, half town legend. Children whispered about it at school, and adults theorized in hushed tones at the local grocery store. The car's fleeting appearance had drawn suspicion because it felt foreign in a place where outsiders rarely lingered after dark. Some swore the SUV had peeled away from the salon precisely at the moment the first police cruiser arrived, its tires screeching and headlights swallowed by the night, but others described it simply vanishing as if it had never been there at all. The police, feeling the mounting pressure from the town's growing anxiety, requested backup from the county, distributing flyers and issuing public appeals for anyone who had seen the SUV to come forward. Mechanics in the county were interviewed, auto parts stores checked recent sales for the unique wheel design, and even body shops were asked if a blue Ford had come in for repairs post-July 31st. A partial license plate number surfaced from an elderly man, Mr. Barnes, who kept meticulous notes about every vehicle that passed his porch. Unfortunately, with limited technology, his recollection, something like CBX1***, was just enough to create frustration. It produced a list of dozens of potential matches within 3 neighboring counties, ranging from legitimate family vehicles to repossessed rentals. The police, undeterred, set about interviewing each of the individuals linked to the list, often meeting confused retirees and exasperated teenagers who had nothing to do with Briarwood. None panned out as a direct hit. Alongside the search, a police artist worked with Sheila Moore to produce a composite sketch of the driver she witnessed fleeing the salon. The resulting image, a young man with light wavy brown hair, anxious eyes and a slight build, circulated without a name to go with it, but several townspeople remarked it bore resemblance to a Johnson boy from the next county over. Detectives followed up, but privacy laws around minors and the lack of concrete evidence kept them from making further progress against the chief suspect. Instead, the blue SUV case files filled with grainy sketches and tantalizing near misses. Meanwhile, the SUV's symbolism morphed. It stood as a dark totem for the town's lingering fear. Its image appeared in sketches at candlelight vigils, and children dared each other to spot it on late evening walks. The mere thought of that car hovering on Main Street became for many shorthand for a town's lost innocence and the randomness of violence that had entered their lives. Behind the scenes, detectives also entertained the possibility that the SUV owner, or driver, might have left town entirely, especially if their actions had drawn too much suspicion. Roadblocks and alerts were put out across state lines. Regional law enforcement checked with motels, convenience stores, and emergency rooms, searching for anyone matching the sketch or acting nervous. Still, with no fingerprints in the car and no DNA, the trail remained frustratingly thin. Gradually, as months passed and new tips trickled in with diminishing frequency, the blue SUV became almost mythic. It was the what if, the crucial missing piece that everyone was convinced would solve the puzzle, if only it would reappear. Parents warned their children to avoid strange vehicles while the legend of the blue Ford grew with each retelling, each time subtly shifting in exact description, but never diminishing in power. The frustration for the lead detective, who had once felt so close to an answer, was palpable. He often drove down Main Street late at night, parking where the SUV had last been seen, replaying witness statements and the sound of Sheila's panicked 911 call in his mind. He'd sit, watching headlights drift by, waiting for the unlikely return of the ghostly car. The case became personal for him, and for many in law enforcement, who carried pictures of the mysterious SUV along with their badges and notepads. Ultimately, although the blue SUV would not yield the immediate break investigators desperately needed at the time, it remained preserved in the collective awareness of Briarwood. It was a symbol of hope, that there was still a thread hanging, one day to be unraveled. The story of the blue Ford would echo through years of community remembrance and, in a bittersweet twist, prove central when fresh eyes and science finally brought justice to Dana Whitfield's case. The vehicle and the sketch. In the aftermath of Dana Whitfield's murder, the Briarwood investigation found itself repeatedly drawn back to two enigmatic clues: the elusive blue SUV spotted on Main Street and the composite sketch that Sheila Moore, the accidental witness, helped produce. These seemingly simple leads would spiral into complex threads, each tugging at the patience and determination of everyone involved in the case. Looking back now, it's astonishing how a few fleeting glimpses and the outline of a stranger's face could command so much fear and hope for justice. The vehicle quickly became an obsession for local law enforcement. By late August 1995, the blue Ford SUV was the town's most watched phantom, inspiring 1,000 rumors and nearly as many false sightings. Briarwood's uniformed officers fanned out, clipboard and camera in hand, across Spartanburg County and beyond. Behind the scenes, Captain Rollins and his lead detective, Avery Moss, built their own private map, colored pins marking every reported appearance of a similar vehicle in the county, notes scrawled in the margins about time, location, and the demeanor of whoever was seen behind the wheel. The pressure was unbearable. Night after night, desperate residents called in with tips. A blue Ford outside the post office after hours, a suspicious SUV idling by the high school parking lot, another in the shadows near the creek road on the town's edge. Detectives ran down each lead, chasing shadows and hunches, sometimes on nothing more than the echo of a rumor. For every plausible sighting, there were a dozen that led nowhere. Ordinary cars driven by neighbors who, while sympathetic to Dana's death, grew increasingly frustrated with being stopped and questioned during their evening errands. Parallel to the boots-on-the-ground manhunt, the task force leaned into their best available technology. Security videotapes from gas stations, banks, and grocery stores within a 30-mile radius were collected, a Herculean task before the digital age. Most yielded only murky blobs and washed-out taillights, but in two frames captured by an old security camera at Main Diner, detectives glimpsed what appeared to be the blue SUV in question. The vehicle rolled through an intersection near the Salon, headlights stark in the grainy footage. Dozens of officers and volunteers squinted at those frames, trying to determine the license plate or catch a glimpse of the driver's profile. But when the image was lightened, zoomed, and reprinted, the plate remained unreadable, just a muddled slash of white against blue paint. Complicating matters further, There was disagreement about whether the SUV was driven by a man or a woman, whether it was old or new, and whether it had a dent on its left rear quarter panel. The sheer range of reports soon highlighted how unreliable memory could be in stressful circumstances. Eyewitnesses meant well, but sometimes they heard the theories swirling in the streets and began to remember what others had already said. Still, into the evidence file went every detail: a cartoon dog bumper sticker, custom silver rims, maybe a scratch along the passenger door. No lad was too trivial, no call too routine. If the blue Ford reappeared, Rollins wanted his team to be ready. What truly galvanized the investigation, however, was the composite sketch meticulously built from Sheila Moore's terrified recollection. Law enforcement brought in a forensic artist from Colombia, a patient woman with the gentle aura of a kindergarten teacher, who worked with Sheila for hours. Their session played out in a quiet room at the sheriff's office, Sheila sipping sweet tea and trembling as she described freckles, the angle of a jawline, the nervous dart of someone's eyes. The artist would sketch, show her progress, and start again. By the end, they had produced a portrait that captured not just a face, but an expression, a peculiar blend of guilt and raw panic. The sketch was photocopied and plastered around the town hall, schools, gas stations, and local cafes. It even made the cover of the local paper below the headline, "Do you know this man?" The sight of the drawing sent ripples through Briarwood. People studied it as they shopped, whispered about it during church potlucks, and compared it to acquaintances or strangers they passed in the street. Some swore they recognized the man from the grocery line, the bank counter, or band practice at the high school. Yet every supposed match fizzled when detectives ran backgrounds, checked alibis, and pored through their lists. Meanwhile, the connection between the SUV and the sketch became a town obsession. At diners and corner stores, people argued about whether the anxious young man in the drawing could have possibly driven the blue Ford, and if so, why he was lurking near the salon that night. The theories grew more far-fetched as the weeks dragged on. Maybe he was an outsider looking for trouble. Maybe he was a jilted ex or a drifter passing through. Despite steadfast efforts, the identity behind both clues remained tantalizingly out of reach. The police's next step was to trace vehicle registrations. The DMV provided the department with a list of all blue Ford SUVs within a 50-mile radius. There were more than 100. Detectives, already running low on sleep, divided up the names and addresses, visiting each one, jotting down whether the owner matched the composite sketch or had any alibi for the night of Dana's murder. Some owners offered to show their paperwork, walk officers around their cars, and even provide employment records. Others grumbled at the intrusion. More than one encounter grew heated as suspicion fell on innocent drivers. In almost every instance, the story ended the same: not our suspect, not our car. Fortune finally shifted when an officer, double-checking his paperwork late one evening, noticed a record showing a blue Ford Explorer registered under Mary Johnson, a widow living just outside Briarwood. Though Mary had not been seen driving the SUV near the crime scene, her teenage son Jonathan had been known to borrow the car often. More interesting still, school attendance records showed Jonathan absent the day after Dana's murder, the only time in that semester he'd missed class. When questioned, Mary Johnson tearfully admitted that her son had come home late the night of the murder, looking rattled and withdrawn. She believed he had been with friends, brushing it off as teenage mischief, but now, in the harsh light of hindsight, her confidence crumbled. Detectives pressed to speak with Jonathan, but the family, citing his age and a lawyer's advice, refused without a formal charge. The rules protecting minors complicated the process, leaving law enforcement with a gut feeling rather than solid proof. Meanwhile, the sketch continued to haunt the investigation. Sheila Moore reviewed it again and again under police supervision, quietly reaffirming that certain features, especially the mouth and brow, were a striking match to Jonathan Johnson, her high school classmate from just a few years prior. Other students, when shown the sketch in confidence, supported her observation. Yet without physical evidence or a confession, the case hit a tense stalemate. Rumor and suspicion swirled through Briarwood. Some neighbors grew wary of the Johnson family and whispered at the edges of school board meetings, while others pleaded for police not to jump to conclusions without more than a drawing and a missing teenage alibi. Desperate for a breakthrough, Captain Rollins contacted the FBI for advice regarding the proper procedural steps when dealing with a minor as a potential suspect. They advised patience and extreme caution, given the lack of direct evidence. The task force remained on high alert. They surveilled the Johnson home discreetly, and kept Jonathan's name pinned beside the composite, hoping time or guilt might trigger a mistake. For a time, the investigation into the vehicle and the sketch became parallel lines, never quite meeting. The blue SUV, parked and then vanished, started to fade from new eyewitness accounts, but not from the minds of the people of Briarwood. The composite sketch lingered on corkboards and pinned inside desk drawers at the police station, serving as a constant reminder of a town's collective uncertainty and grief. The sense of a community suspended, unwilling to let the story go, yet unable to force the truth from the shadows, became its own torment. In the years that followed, even when more urgent news overtook the headlines, both the vehicle and the sketch retained a mythic quality. Whenever any new crime occurred or any unfamiliar car prowled the neighborhood, someone inevitably raised the specter of the blue Ford and the unnamed young man. Teachers whispered to each other in the teacher's lounge, store clerks traded tales at closing, and every so often a fresh tip would trickle in, reigniting old hope. Most striking of all, these clues proved that, in a close-knit town, memories run deep. Sometimes they sharpen, sometimes they blur, but the longing for closure never fully dissipates. Briarwood would wait years for scientific advances to finally match DNA to their long-suspected lead. Yet before that day came, the stories and sketches and ghostly vehicles hung in the air like unfinished prayers, as persistent as the summer heat and as indelible as grief itself. Forensics and the cold case. In the aftermath of Dana's murder, the hope for a quick solution in Briarwood faded as the months dragged by. The initial traces left at the scene, DNA, fingerprints, fibers, had promised so much in those first hectic weeks, but each promising lead seemed to wither in the harsh light of scientific scrutiny and procedural reality. While the collective energy of the police and lab technicians was intense at first, eventually exhaustion and a sense of futility settled in as tests came back inconclusive or unmatchable. The heart of the evidence rested on one cold case essential: biological traces left behind in the intimate, chaotic struggle of that July evening. Forensics teams meticulously gathered samples from the salon's tiled floor, from hairbrushes and sinks, even from the utility closet Dana had been found. In 1995, however, forensic science was in a transitional state. DNA profiling was powerful, but its reach limited by comparatively shallow databases and technology that required larger, cleaner samples than the minute scraps often recovered from real-world scenes. Even with these technological constraints, analysts extracted several viable DNA samples, including one critical sample from inside the utility closet and another from Dana's personal hairbrush, presumably to establish her profile as a control. The hope was straightforward: link a unique DNA pattern to someone in the national or state database. For a moment, spirits ran high as the lab worked late into the night, but when the results came, the unknown male DNA didn't match any entry in the South Carolina or national offender databases. No previous convictions, no familiar faces, no simple villain waiting to be identified and brought to justice. It was a ghost, genetic proof haunting the records but refusing to point a finger at a living soul. As weeks passed, detectives and analysts expanded their search. They checked with neighboring states, updated entries in the hope that a future crime by the perpetrator might trigger a match, and carefully preserved every evidence sample in sealed, cooled lockers, pinning their hopes to the future of science. The investigators knew that DNA's value might unlock more 20 years down the line than it ever could in the 1990s, but that provided cold comfort to the family and to the town. Meanwhile, other avenues were not ignored. Fingerprints were dusted from every usable surface compared to employees, customers, and even maintenance workers who had visited in the weeks leading up to the murder. Each fingerprint was cataloged and cross-referenced against what limited records were available. Like the DNA, none matched any known offenders, and each potential suspect was painstakingly eliminated. The same story played out with hair and fiber samples. Collected in plastic baggies, logged, tabulated compared to Dana's personal effects, scene cleaners, even the uniforms of first responders. Again, there was no break, just a mounting file of negatives. Despite their frustrations, forensic experts worked methodically, creating an archive of evidence so thoroughly cataloged that, even as hope waned, the groundwork for future breakthroughs was quietly being laid. Each piece of material, every strand of hair, even an accidental smudge of shampoo on the wall, became a testament to the community's unwillingness to abandon Dana. With the passing years, the pressure mounted for law enforcement to demonstrate diligence. In the late 1990s, as cold case squads became more common across the country, Briarwood's case was periodically reviewed by new investigators. Each time they returned to the science. Could a new reagent reveal a previously invisible print? Could mitochondrial DNA analysis, only just gaining popularity, illuminate a maternal lineage? These incremental advances brought moments of optimism, but the major DNA sample, the one everyone knew was the killer, remained unclaimed. During this period, the evidence locker took on a near mythic status within the precinct. Detectives, both veteran and rookie, would walk past and pause, staring at the neatly labeled bags and boxes, sometimes running their fingers along the notations, hoping their own hunch might be the one that finally cracked the case. For some, it was a symbol of personal failure. For others, a rallying cry and proof that persistence mattered, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Community involvement didn't fade entirely either. Vigil groups organized annual remembrance events, with members quietly asking if police had found anything new. Emotional pressure on law enforcement remained consistent. For the town, every dead end was another wound, a reminder that justice was so tantalizingly close, yet out of reach. Many believed that the passage of time would only dull the urgency, but for those closest to Dana, grief remained as sharp as ever. The salon, even after reopening under new ownership, bore invisible scars, a place of whispers, its mirrors reflecting both hope and sorrow. In parallel, the profile of the unknown suspect slowly became a kind of phantom around which the narrative of the cold case revolved. With each passing year, the story gained new iterations: the blue SUV, the composite sketch, the mysterious absence of evidence pointing to robbery, the chilling specificity of the attack. The tale was passed down in families and gossiped about by new residents. Teachers and parents reminded children about the consequences of violence and the belief, instilled into local culture, that some secrets may sleep for years before returning to the light. The relentless forward push of forensic science was the one true hope. By the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology, amplification, miniaturized analysis kits, growing databases, meant that cases once thought hopeless were being solved across the country. Briarwood's evidence, lovingly cataloged and preserved, was now eligible for re-examination using hypersensitive methods unavailable a decade before. When the call finally came to run the original samples again, some officers held their breath. Would it be enough? Would a name rise at last from a string of anonymous molecules locked in a freezer all these years? The result at first was both a heartbreak and a quiet triumph. The DNA yielded a profile so precise that experts were certain it belonged to the killer. Still, there was no match in even the new, vastly larger databases. No sudden hit, no criminal finally exposed. The promise of forensics lingered as both comfort and curse. What truly changed in this era, and gave the victims' advocates and investigators the strength to persist, was an evolving understanding that science was not infallible but cumulative. Each effort, itself a leap of faith, added a layer to the case's foundation. The smallest thread of evidence, even one deemed inconclusive by old standards, might one day become the missing key. Detectives became archivists as much as investigators, preserving not just evidence but the hope of eventual closure. For years, the cold case label haunted Dana's story. Generations of police rotated through the file, each adding notes, cross-referencing names, and rechecking the lab logs. None could completely let go, because science, more than intuition or rumor, carried the silent promise that Dana would not be forgotten. When eventually a match was made to the once anonymous profile, thanks to a fateful genetic connection and decades of careful perseverance, it vindicated the faith placed in progress. For the families who wait and the communities who endure, the legacy of the cold case and its forensics is more than a file in a cabinet. It's the stubborn, necessary belief that no wrong remains hidden forever. The reopened case and a new investigator. In 2005, as the humid southern summer returned for its annual reign over Briarwood, a quiet revolution was taking place inside the Spartanburg County Sheriff's Department. Time, as it often does in small towns, had both dulled and deepened the wounds of Dana Whitfield's murder. The case file, thick, battered, and dog-eared from a decade's worth of hands thumbing through it, sat nearly forgotten on a high shelf, gathering a film of dust that belied the urgency that once surrounded it. For many, the crime had quietly faded into town folklore, a tale whispered between generations with more questions than answers. But for some, especially Dana's family, there was no such thing as moving on, only waiting and wondering if justice would ever find them. Enter Thomas Carter, recently elected sheriff and known for his stubborn optimism in the face of overwhelming odds. Carter believed two things above all: every cold case deserved a fresh set of eyes, and no family should have to live without closure. His approach was methodical, almost obsessive. He read every scrap of testimony, every lab report, and every sidelong comment scribbled in the margin by detectives long since retired. More importantly, he wasn't weighed down by local loyalties and old grudges. What he wanted was truth, no matter how tangled or how long it took. Carter's first move was unconventional. He reached out to Thomas Smith, a retired FBI profiler with a reputation for solving the most stubborn of cold cases. Smith was lured less by the promise of glory than by a genuine fascination with the intricacies of unsolved crimes. He too took the case file and read it not as a bureaucratic exercise, but as a living narrative, one filled with missed cues, buried secrets, and the faintest glimmer of hope that something, somewhere, had been overlooked. The two Thomases, as the department soon nicknamed them, became partners in a race against time and memory. Step one was creating a psychological autopsy. Smith spent weeks reconstructing the daily habits, social circles, and emotional landscapes of everyone in Dana's orbit: her family, her estranged husband, salon clients, even high school acquaintances who had drifted away years before. He mapped out frustration, jealousy, grudges, and patterns of affection, trying to visualize the shadow that might one day have bloomed into violence. Unsurprisingly, the blue SUV and the mysterious composite sketch surfaced again and again, demanding attention like stubborn phantoms. Meanwhile, Carter brought new technology to bear. Advances in forensic testing, once the stuff of crime dramas, were now a reality, even for a rural county department. He ordered that every evidence sample, painstakingly preserved for over a decade, be retested using the latest DNA amplification methods. Technicians now wore gloves with finer mesh. Crime labs could extract useful genetic material from samples so small they'd once been dismissed as useless. For Carter, the philosophy was simple. If there was even a shred of hope in a forgotten envelope or an overlooked swipe from a doorknob, it was worth running down. It was around this time that a surprising development surfaced. Dana's aging mother, who'd never once missed a memorial or police update, reached out shyly to Carter. She mentioned that Michael Price, a former classmate of both Dana and the long-suspected Jonathan Johnson, had recently returned to Briarwood after years away. Michael had always felt uncomfortable about what he'd witnessed around the time of Dana's death, but had left town soon after out of fear and confusion. Now, with the killer still unpunished, he felt compelled to break his silence. In a tense after-hours interview held in Carter's wood-paneled office, Michael slowly recounted what he remembered from the summer of 1995. He described Jonathan's strange obsession with Dana, the way he'd circle the block, park his mother's blue Ford Explorer in sight of the salon, and make awkward attempts to catch Dana's attention. Michael recalled overhearing a disturbing confession from Jonathan just days after Dana's murder, and admitted he'd always felt a pang of guilt for not coming forward. Hearing Michael's detailed testimony for the first time, Carter and Smith felt the adrenaline spike that only comes when scattered pieces start to coalesce. Smith compared Michael's account with old statements and noticed consistencies, details about Jonathan's schedule, his unpredictable mood swings, even patterns in the shop's closing routine that only a careful observer, or a stalker, would know. Michael's story didn't just fit, it clarified gaps that had left police spinning for years. With this new impetus, Carter ordered a re-interview of everyone living near the Johnson family at the time of the murder. Little by little, the investigative net began to close. Tiny discrepancies emerged in old statements: neighbors who remembered Jonathan's odd late-night walks, a schoolmate who quietly recalled seeing him return home after midnight, a retired officer who had always suspected something but lacked the proof to voice his concerns. Every thread, no matter how old, formed part of a new tapestry. Meanwhile, Smith retraced the original investigator's steps regarding the blue SUV, this time integrating timelines from Michael's revelations and new forensic data. He overlaid traffic camera footage, utility records, and cell phone tower logs, now easier to analyze with improved digital tools. A portrait of Jonathan emerged, not just as a troubled teen who happened to be in the wrong place, but as a young man whose patterns and motives increasingly aligned with the brutal, personal nature of Dana's murder. A momentous breakthrough came with the retesting of physical evidence. Forensic scientists had kept Dana's personal hairbrush, used as a DNA reference, and several swabs from the crime scene sealed in climate-controlled storage. When run through the now national DNA database, a conclusive match was made, directly tying Jonathan to the biological evidence left in the salon. The statistics were impossible to ignore. This wasn't merely suspicion or circumstantial alignment, it was scientific certainty. Yet Carter moved cautiously. The last thing he wanted was another public debacle or worse, a conviction overturned on technicalities. He and Smith spent weeks meticulously documenting every stage of the new investigation, making sure every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every analysis could withstand the scrutiny of court. They consulted with experts in chain of custody protocol, conferred with prosecutors on the most effective presentation of evidence, and reached out to Dana's family before making anything official. The day the arrest warrant was issued for Jonathan Johnson, Carter called a somber press conference. The town's collective breath seemed to hitch as he described, without hyperbole, the long arc of their search for justice. For those who had waited years, it was both a moment of catharsis and a reminder of everything lost. The cold case, once consigned to a dusty archive, had found new life thanks to dogged police work, modern science, and the unwavering perseverance of a handful of people who refused to forget. But perhaps the quietest victory belonged to Dana's family. When Carter personally delivered the news, hesitating only for a moment, uncertain whether relief could ever truly match the pain of memory, her mother hugged him and wept. Smith, standing nearby, found himself unexpectedly moved. In that moment the case ceased being a file or a puzzle, it returned to what it had been all along, a promise that every life, however briefly illuminated, is worth everything it takes to protect and honor its memory. Testimony unveiled a horrifying truth. As the investigation reached a fever pitch with fresh forensic evidence and renewed attention, the stage was set for a revelation that would finally lift the decades-old fog over Briarwood. The catalyst came in the form of Michael Price, the same former classmate who had been torn for years by the memory of a summer night and a secret too dark to bear. His testimony, when it finally spilled forth under the soft overhead lights of Sheriff Carter's small, wood-paneled office, felt like a window snapping open after years of suffocating silence. Michael's recollections didn't begin with a melodramatic confession. They started with the ordinary, which is what made them so haunting. He remembered Jonathan Johnson as a quiet but intense teenager, given to long silences punctuated by sudden bursts of conversation. Jonathan, Michael explained, had fixated on Dana Whitfield with the kind of adolescent obsession that wavered between admiration and resentment. As classmates, Michael and Jonathan had often driven around after dusk, windows down to the thick South Carolina summer air, winding through Briarwood's sleepy lanes. It was on these drives, aimless to any adult but significant to two teenage boys, that Michael first noticed Jonathan's gaze lingering on the Briarwood hair studio, or his sudden mood changes when conversations drifted to Dana. In the weeks preceding the murder, Jonathan's behavior had grown erratic. He made offhand comments about how someone like Dana would never notice a guy like me, and grew sullen when she was seen laughing with customers. Michael didn't think much of it. What teenager didn't nurse a hidden crush or a wounded pride? What he did remember, especially in hindsight, were the late-night loops past the salon, the way Jonathan would slow the car and search for a glimpse of Dana, sometimes making circuit after circuit around Main Street in restless silence. The night of the murder, Michael's memory became clearer and more chilling. Jonathan called him around 7, asking to hang out but seeming jumpy, distracted. They met briefly, sharing a fast food meal in Michael's driveway. Jonathan excused himself early, saying he needed a haircut before a planned trip the next day, even though it was late for any salon to still be open. Michael, half distracted by television in the background, didn't press the point and soon forgot about it. Until hours later, he saw Jonathan's mother's blue SUV speed by his street, heading away from downtown. He said he felt the urge to call out, but the moment passed, lost in the blur of an ordinary summer night. In the days after Dana's murder, the energy in town turned electric, suspicious, tense, filled with speculation. Jonathan barely showed his face. When he did, he was distant, a tightness in his movements that Michael had never seen before. Michael remembered one encounter in particular, just 2 days after the murder, when Jonathan admitted to feeling messed up and blurted out that he had been there at the salon. Michael pressed, confused and alarmed all at once. Jonathan's eyes grew wild. He backpedaled, then said softly, "I just wanted to talk. Something bad happened." Pulled between loyalty and horror, Michael let the secret fester. Months later, almost as if trying to shed the stain of Briarwood, Jonathan enlisted in the military and vanished from town for years, his past unresolved and unexplained. Michael, meanwhile, grew older, carrying the burden of what he suspected. He told himself he had no proof, that Jonathan's confession was vague, that the memory must have grown distorted over time, but the guilt never faded. When Dana's face flashed across the news at every anniversary, Michael's regret and suspicion pierced fresh wounds. He started keeping a journal, noting what he remembered and what he feared, until the day, years later, when he heard through a mutual friend that Jonathan was back in South Carolina. In Carter's office, the recounting of this story was slow and halting at times, but the details were piercing. Michael remembered seeing a torn jacket in the back of the SUV, stained in a way that stood out even against the dark upholstery. He remembered Jonathan's hands, the knuckles scraped as if he'd been in a fight, and the way he washed obsessively in the days that followed. Most damning, Michael revealed, was his memory of the night Jonathan returned home after Dana's murder. He had crashed on Michael's couch for a few hours, silent, shaken, his clothes smelling of bleach and something acrid Michael couldn't name. Michael chalked it up to the working-class boys' lives, dirt, cleaner, sometimes sweat or even blood from a scraped arm or angry bad luck. But when news of the murder broke the next morning, everything took on new significance. Police found Michael's testimony indispensable. Taken alongside the newly matched DNA, the composite sketch, and Jonathan's inability to adequately explain his whereabouts or injuries, the case gained a new cohesion. Michael's account filled in crucial blanks, the timeline of Jonathan's movements, the psychological profile that had eluded the original investigators, and a tangible reason for why, after so many years, justice might finally catch up to the secret that haunted not just one soul, but an entire town. Testimony from several other classmates and neighbors, corroborated by journal notes and work logs, reinforced the chilling portrait of Jonathan's descent into obsession and isolation in the summer of 1995. A teacher remembered Jonathan staring blankly out the window on the last day of school, doodling DW in the margins of his notebook. An elderly neighbor recalled the blue SUV idling near the corner store late at night for several evenings before the murder, and a night clerk at Main Diner finally stepped forward, still haunted by fleeting glimpses of Jonathan's anxious face. Ultimately, Michael's courage in coming forward, years after the fact, became both a catharsis and a warning. In small towns, secrets rarely disappear. The truth, as revealed, was horrifying not just for its violence but for the subtler betrayals that allowed it to fester so long unchecked. For Dana's family and for Briarwood, it was the final painful step from rumor to fact, from unresolved grief to the start of closure. The horrifying truth, once buried in a tangle of memory, loyalty, and fear, now stood as a testament to the persistence of community, the ache of regret, and the redemptive possibility, even in darkness, of finally telling what needs to be told. Justice, at last. There's a particular tension in the air when a community has lived decades with an unanswered crime. The pursuit of justice becomes both a curse and a hope. A curse for the wounds it keeps open, a hope that what's lost can at least be honored with truth. In the case of Briarwood, justice wasn't swift, and for many years, it seemed unlikely to ever visit at all, until science at last gave the town the closure it needed. By the early 2000s, the atmosphere in Briarwood had shifted. The once relentless media interest had faded, but the townspeople hadn't forgotten. Hard questions persisted. How could someone so close have committed such a monstrous act? Would the Whitfield family ever find peace? Would Dana's memory always and only be connected to unsolved tragedy? It was against this backdrop that the major break occurred, and the air of stagnation in the case began to thin. When the advanced DNA results returned, definitively matching Jonathan Johnson to biological evidence from Dana Whitfield's murder, it was as if a storm swept through town, a mixture of shock, relief, and disbelief. Law enforcement had taken extraordinary care not to promise too much during the retesting. All the same, when Sheriff Carter called a press conference to announce that an arrest had been made, many in Briarwood wept openly. Some shook with anger, others flooded the police station with flowers and thank you notes. The sense of collective exhale was palpable, even in the weighty silence that often follows enormous news. Jonathan Johnson's arrest was a surreal experience for everyone involved. For years he'd been a shadow figure in the case, rumored about, quietly suspected, but never formally charged. Some townsfolk remembered him as a withdrawn, troubled youth who had flitted in and out of school. Others recalled his pale face from the infamous composite sketch or his mother's blue Ford Explorer, now a grim landmark in Briarwood lore. When detectives arrived to serve the warrant, they did so with firm resolve but quiet dignity, aware that in a small town every arrest ripples outward. The community's response wavered between vindication and complicated grief. The Johnson family, longtime Briarwood residents, were suddenly the focus of sympathetic whispers and sidelong glances. Older neighbors recalled the years following the murder when rumors ran wild, but now there was a kind of resigned relief. Even answers 20 years late were better than a lifetime of questions. For Dana's family, news of the arrest was both a balm and a wound reopened. Her mother, who had become a familiar figure at every vigil and police update, could finally mourn out loud. Her children, grown now, forever defined by loss, spoke of their mother with fresh conviction, relieved to know the man responsible would face the consequences of his actions. Jonathan's trial became a major event for Briarwood, fueling intense emotions and drawing news crews back to town for the first time in years. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, neighbors crowded into the public gallery, and for a brief time life in the small town revolved around testimony, verdicts, and the fragile rituals of justice. In the courtroom, prosecutors built their case with a steadiness born from years of waiting. The newly matched DNA was their pillar, and witness testimony filled out the rest. Michael Price's recollections, the nerve-wracking 911 call from Sheila Moore, patterns in Jonathan's behavior never fully explained away. Even the blue SUV, long a symbol of ambiguity, found its place as compelling circumstantial evidence. What struck many observers most wasn't the ferocity of courtroom argument but the dignity Dana's loved ones brought to the process. They endured cross-examinations, relentless speculation, and the psychological strain of seeing a loved one's life dissected for public consumption. Yet through it all, they kept returning to one simple refrain: justice for Dana, no matter how slow. When the guilty verdict was finally read, there was no eruption, just an exhausted sigh of relief. A weight that had quietly pressed upon shoulders throughout Briarwood finally lifted, if only for a moment. Jonathan Johnson was sentenced to life in prison without parole, the harshest penalty short of death under state law. The judge, recognizing the profound endurance of Dana's family and the town, remarked that justice had not been swift, but it was now complete. But as often happens in true stories, the end of the legal drama wasn't the end for those who lived through it. Ripples from the case touched nearly every corner of Briarwood. For months after, conversations continually circled back to what justice meant. Some neighbors wondered aloud if they'd ever been in danger themselves. Others privately reflected on how they'd judged or suspected the wrong people over the years. More than a few admitted they'd carried guilt, perhaps for ignoring their instincts, for not pressing the police harder, or for missing subtle signs of Jonathan's deteriorating mental health in their own community. Dana's memory, too, began to shift in the town's collective consciousness, not from a symbol of tragedy alone, but as a catalyst for a new sense of watchfulness and care for one another. The successful prosecution also reignited interest in unresolved cases in Briarwood and the surrounding counties. Most notably, questions lingered about Jonathan's possible involvement in another local disappearance, the case of his former fiancée, Heather. Heather's fate had never been fully explained, and Dana's family quietly hoped that recent scientific and procedural breakthroughs might yet provide answers for Heather's loved ones too. Town leaders, meanwhile, championed improvements in victim support services and expanded funding for forensic science programs, determined not to let another case go unsolved for so long. Years later, the case of Dana Whitfield's murder still reverberated. Her children, now parents themselves, spoke at local colleges about the cost of violence and the power of persistence. Sheriff Carter, having fulfilled his pledge to the Whitfields and the community, became a defender of cold case funding and better technology for rural jurisdictions. Even the blue Ford Explorer, for so long a symbol of darkness, eventually faded from memory as the town slowly reclaimed the places that had once felt forever marred by the unsolved crime. The story of justice in Briarwood was, in the end, about more than accountability for a single crime. It was a testament to resilience, of a family's patience, a community's unwillingness to let go, and the eventual triumph of science partnered with human determination. The lesson that lingered, etched into the stone outside Briarwood Hair Studio, recounted around dinner tables, was that justice, though it may falter and stumble, can ultimately arrive. Redemption in Briarwood did not mean forgetting what had come before, but living forward with the hard-won knowledge that truth, however long in coming, is always worth the fight.